Hello and welcome to the Drum History Podcast. I'm your host, Bart Vanderzee, and today we are joined back on the show by our old friend, William Johnson. William, welcome back on the podcast, man.
Thank you so much for having me. It's an honor each time.
Absolutely. So the first episode was about ethnomusicology and the study of it, and that's still a huge part of that's who you are, is an ethnomusicologist. But beyond that, producer, educator. Your YouTube channel is amazing. You consistently put out great content, courses, cool stuff. Like if you're watching on YouTube right now, you can see behind William, his room is just awesome. And it's absolutely full of cool drums, which I remember from last time. So anyway, great to have you back on. But what we're going to be talking about today is like such a specific and interesting topic that it's perfect for this show. You told me that you've been working on a course deep diving into shakers, and my spidey sense went off being like, that's perfect. That's an episode. We got to do it. And here we are. So maybe just explain a little bit about the course you're working on, and then we can deep dive into like what kind of shakers, techniques, everything you've been learning about and preparing for this course.
Yes. So thank you for having me on here. I really enjoy your show. I was listening to a show not long ago about the junk hat. Yeah, I love that.
Yeah, the bald man.
The bald man. Yeah, that was great. That was great stuff. Right up my alley right there. Yep. So I decided, I've been working on this Percussion 101. I call it the Art of Rhythm Percussion 101 course, where it's basically it's anywhere approximately, I don't have an exact count, but about 50 plus videos of just mostly a contemporary approach to percussion. So, everything from the triangle to congas to bongos to shakers, right? Yeah. And I realized that, while I was working on this, I was like, well, I could probably just go ahead and lay out some of this in little pieces. And I was trying to figure out, well, what should I do first? And I noticed that a couple of my kabasa videos, which is basically, for those of you that may or may not know, a lot of this popular instrument, this kabasa. Yep. I noticed that for whatever reason, the posts on the kabasa were amongst my more popular ones on Instagram and YouTube. And
that's interesting. Never would have guessed that.
I literally have posted about them a couple times and some shaker stuff for content. I mean, I like to share it, but I was like, well, this will be cool. And next thing I know, I'm like, okay, why in the world does that kabasa video have 150,000 views? I'm like, I mean, it's hard to, whatever.
For people listening and not watching, in case they don't know, it's the kabasa is the instrument you hold on the bottom, and then you put your hand, there's a metal cylinder, and you kind of spin it against not a grate, but like a textured metal.
Yeah. Like thinking an elevator. If you were an old school or industrial elevator and they had that steel sheeting on the wall.
Yes.
Right? It's like that. So that's what it sounds like, right?
Yep.
So, and that's typically the way people play it. You hold it in your hand, and then your other hand twists the handle as you play it.
Yeah. Okay? I have a buddy who has a foot controlled one.
Yes.
Which is cool.
Yeah. And it's made by, several companies make them now, but I believe Mino makes that as well. This is a Mino one. But yeah, I made a post not long ago about the kabasa, and this is what I had already thought about doing something with shakers, but I was like, I mean, who's going to really be interested in a whole series just about playing the shaker, right? That's my thinking. But when I did the kabasa thing, I get regular questions from drummers, from singers, from people wanting to get better at it, or saying, what are some other things I can do? So I posted about playing this kabasa, which if you're listening, it has as you mentioned, has a long or medium-sized handle with foam on it, and then it's a cylindrical shape. So it's almost like a very thick ice cream sandwich, right? Yeah. And literally the beads are made from, they're this very similar thing you pull a light switch with.
Yeah.
Those little beads. And now we use them as the things that sizzle on the
It looks
cymbal.
like a sizzler. Yeah.
Exactly.
Or sizzle,
exactly.
yeah.
Yeah. So instead of, I was playing it like a shaker. So, just playing it here, right? It makes a great shaker.
Sounds good.
But then
yeah.
if you use your hand like a tambourine, it's kind of, sometimes we do this stuff with tambourines to stop the shaker as accents while you keep the shaking. Now you can create it as a drum/percussion instrument and a shaker, right? So.
Oh, yeah.
Right. And then, you could play whatever kind of grooves you want. Or the clave thing I was doing before.
Sure.
Right. So,
yeah.
So now that, for whatever reason, is popular. And of course, you add on that kind of stuff right there where you just slide it with the momentum. Now you have the shaker. You have this, or you can actually hit it. Right, and slide it.
I never thought of all the uses of this. I mean, it's of the kabasa. It's awesome. Yeah. And I always, at first, someone said it. I was like, "Are you saying kielbasa?" Years ago, it's like, okay, no, that's a sausage.
Right. Yeah, and very tasty, very
tasty sausage. Yeah,
yeah. So the first time I posted, most on a recent, because I did a couple YouTube videos a couple years ago, but on Instagram, the first time recently that I posted, it just it did very well. And so I thought, okay, well, that did well. Then I did the same thing, saying that same technique we could use with a shaker. And and by shaker, now we're getting anything you put with the container and the element inside and you shake it is going to be a shaker, right?
Yeah.
But this particular shaker, I was using that similar technique, but this is just a, I forget what I found out it was called. So it's just a long, very flexible plastic tube with a cap on the side you get at a hobby store. I forgot sensory tube. It's called a sensory tube.
Okay.
So you could put like ink and liquid in it and use it for crafts or whatever. That's what you would, if you went to the store to look for this particular one.
Sure.
But then I said, okay, what's got rice in it? You can do the same thing I just did with this shaker. Right? So now you have this shaker, 16th note groove type thing going on here. But now, if I were playing that, I might add some little fills, some little triplet rolls, but also those accents. So if I'm playing with a drummer or if I'm by myself and just a guitarist, let's say I'm just playing with a singer-songwriter or guitarist, now I can also add a backbeat in there.
Yeah.
And I can use my other hand to help, because the element is just kind of, you're having to control it, right? And it's pretty wild. So
sure.
So using these other techniques, you now get more control and you make it like a drum as well. So by doing, for whatever reason, this guy right here just kind of took off and was very popular as well. So I'm thinking, okay, maybe that'll be a good course. Maybe some people will be interested in it. So.
Yeah, and that's the homemade one that you made. I mean, you just put some stuff together. That's the cool thing about shakers is like you'll be in your kitchen and you're making dinner and you're like, you have like the half full thing of rice or whatever, and you just can't help but shake it, or the salt, shaker, and you're just doing it.
Yeah.
And there's so much like that's percussion. That is that's the cool thing about drums is, again, it's like turning a, coffee tin over and playing it. Like we can do what we do anywhere, and it's super valid. And if it sounds good, like, again, if someone was just listening, not watching, seeing, like, what you made looks really good, but you could have, that could be the worst looking thing in the world. But if you're just listening, it doesn't matter, but it does look good.
Thanks. It's definitely, I love stuff like this, because when you're playing on a stage, people are like, or they might look, I have one that's a Mrs. Dash bottle. That's
yes.
It was a temporary thing, and I've been using that particular shaker for almost 10 years now. And it's dried.
The upcycle thing.
Yeah. I mean, man. So, and here it is right here. This guy right here. And it was couscous in there. And I've been playing this same thing for the last 10 years. But it's the perfect lush, soft sound for like a ballad, right?
Yeah.
And so the way I view that is, you can, if you're in the studio, it doesn't really matter as much, but it's a time saver. So if I have 10 different textures, I don't have to just EQ. I can just, how about this one? How about this one? How about this one? Right? So
totally.
Yeah.
To me, in my experience, when I used to work at a studio and they would call me in and down the hall and I would play drums on things, and then it was always, all right, now let's do a layer of shaker. All right, now let's do a layer of tambourine. And it was this kind of thing where it was like, in the music on a singer-songwriter or something, it's like you don't really notice it in the mix too much, but when you take it away, then you notice. Like it adds in this perfect level of like, it a lot of times in that sense, because I was doing it myself, it would be like supplementing the hi-hat, or it'd be just adding that little, like a slosh a little bit to it, if that makes sense. And it's
and that's the way I view it. I view it as, it's kind of that, because I do a lot of auxiliary, or not auxiliary, but hybrid percussion type things in a contemporary situation. And it does have that steady it's a steady ostinato you're often playing. So it does have the same role as a hi-hat. And that's the way that I look at it. And then, so if you look at it like a hi-hat, then you can have it be elevated to another level, because now the hi-hat plays more than right? Or so now you can play, so now you can do the same thing on the shaker. And then the thing that's interesting about shakers is that, and we talk about, doing a deep dive or nerding out on it, is it's so ubiquitous, just having, and pervasive and just normal, right? And natural to us, that sometimes we don't stop and think about, okay, well, was the egg shaker, for instance, was that played in recordings in a lot in the 60s or the 50s? And so that's when you start getting, wait a second, maybe, okay, obviously this type of instrument's been around probably since the beginning, but as far as the manufactured contemporary 21st and 20th century shaker, where did that come from? Because that might have come from somewhere, right? So then when you start looking into that history, that's where it starts getting really interesting. But we would never really think about it, because it's like, bruh, it's an egg shaker. Like, I don't know. They just showed up. They've always been playing them, right? But and honestly, when you're the first, when you mentioned shakers and doing this, and then you mentioned the history of shakers, I had never really thought about, okay, the history of shakers. Now that gets into, because I think about it from like an individual instrument. Right. So the kabasa, these things here, the name is actually escaping me, but it's a long leaf pot, right? And these are from Peru, right? These particular ones. And I think one of these is from Mexico, one's from Peru. But now when you get into the actual anthropology or ethnomusicology, the history of that in its folk music, I think about that instrument, not, okay, well, the shaker or like the egg shaker. But then when you go back and you look at the history of, in the United States, of recorded music, then you start thinking, wait, if we go back in the 60s and 70s, the majority of that shaker stuff was DIY, do it yourself, guys in the studio making their own. But a lot of that came from Latin American influences, like the maracas or the gansa or the chocolayo. I'm gonna mess that. I can't remember what it's called, but it's
you could say literally anything, and I would believe you.
But a lot of the shakers that we play are highly influenced by either Cuba or various parts of Latin America or Brazil.
That's interesting.
So you have samba.
Well, and just want to throw out that, like, you think a lot of times of like rock and roll guys and, Led Zeppelin and all the early rockers being so influenced by like jazz music, but I don't think of shakers when I think of jazz music as much. So I think it is definitely the Latin American influence that they were pulling from, like you're saying. But
well, that's interesting too, though, because when you get into jazz and when you get into like the golden era of Afro-Cuban music, so the Latin music, the mambo, so now that is, as jazz is still mainstream, so is Latin jazz, especially in the Western hemisphere, as well as the Eastern, because it goes over into Europe and into West Africa and throughout the world. But you figure they're playing maracas, right?
Yes.
And so now that's mainstream music in the 50s. That's mainstream,
You're
right?
absolutely right. I should have said more like traditional Miles Davis jazz or something like that.
No, but you're right.
As opposed to, but you're right. There is so much of that
brushes
Latin
and all
culture.
the other stuff.
Yeah.
So most people, when I didn't think about it until you had mentioned history of shakers, and I'm like, when you look at a lot of the photos and the videos, and you listen to the people talking from that era, you hear more about like Mick Jagger playing maracas.
Yes.
You see what I'm saying?
Sympathy for the Devil or something like that.
There you go. As opposed to an egg shaker. I don't even know if there's a lot of historians, anthropologists, folk musicians say that's also maybe related to the gansa in Brazil, the cylindrical shakers. A lot of that comes out of the samba as well as other instruments. But so it makes sense that a lot of them would either be playing these Brazilian shakers or they would be playing maracas, or somebody going, hey, this can of beans sounds good. Let's bring this into the studio. Right?
Yeah. I mean, maracas are kind of like, you mentioned kind of ubiquitous things before, like kind of like how bongos, people are like, it's a bongo, it's all bongos. And it's like, well, that's not true. But like maracas, it's like they're playing it, and that just kind of seems like it encompasses all shaky sounds, you know what I mean, back in the 60s or whatever, or like but there's so much more nuance to it than that. But like for those rockers back in the day, they probably grabbed those because that's what was at hand.
Right. And I've actually read a couple articles about Bo Diddley's, if I'm not mistaken, percussionist, and he's one that influenced Mick Jagger. So you figure when you go back with the rock and roll and early rock and roll, that's influenced by the blues and whatnot. So now you have guys like Mick Jagger bringing in the newer era of rock and roll, but it's influenced by these other genres. And so they're bringing in these other folk-like instruments to bring these other, layers onto it. But it's fascinating. And what I thought about too is, so I'm in my late 40s, right? If you have guys that are maybe about, 10 or 15 years older than you and I, they have first-hand knowledge of this and be like, yeah, I don't remember seeing this or that kind of instrument. So for you and I, this is a total like, okay, what were they playing then? But I'm sure if we were about 15, ish more years older, it'd be like, yeah, guys were making their own stuff, or no, there was no egg shakers, because remember, plastic is not really a thing.
Yeah.
Right? So exactly. Not the LP. Yeah.
No. I was going to say, or the for kids, it's the it's Meinl's kids brand. It's like Nuna or something.
Yes,
or
Nino, yeah,
elephant.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
My kids have those, and I'm like, we'll be sitting there playing the drums, and have the baby, and he loves playing with the shaker, and it's like, this is a good sounding egg shaker. Like this sounds really good. Like there's nothing wrong with it at all. But it's interesting to me when you have a bunch of like shakers in front of you, and I'm not sure what the name would be. It's more of the long cylindrical ones where there's usually two of them and you can disconnect them.
Yeah. I have the one Mino makes, the version of, but LP has it where you can twist and connect them. Yep.
Yeah, you twist and connect them. And it just occurred to me, is that so you can mix and match different ones, or do two different hands, or?
Yeah, that's so that all of the above, basically, because you figure you're layering, and that's an important thing when you start getting into like next level, like music production as well. Like if I have a shaker, sometimes all you need to do, let's say another chorus or verse, is take this, right?
Yeah.
And now we have that. But if I stack them now, so just by stacking those, you can get another sound. So yeah, which is interesting that those particular shakers you mentioned, often I've heard it said that they come from the probiotic bottles. I forget, Yakult. I think it's Yakult. So that's what these are. Now look at the shape. Wow. This is exactly what you see with the LP shaker, right? Now look at this Mino's version, and look at these two Yakult bottles held together by a piece of PVC. That's where it came from. So percussionists were doing that as they came out, right? Which, by the way, these are very cheap. You sometimes, depending on where you do your grocery shopping, or might find them. So you got boom. cut those together.
Well, and what I was getting at before is if you have a bunch of stuff in front of you, thinking of those that you have right there, and all kinds of different things, the nuance in the sound of I guess it would be the shape of the bottle, or not the bottle, the shape of the container, the contents inside of it makes such a difference. What it's made out of.
Yep.
What it's made out of. So I bet they were like, I mean, it's just insane how minor little differences can make a big difference in the sound. But I bet with that, like in the example you just said, they probably saw people were using that and said, for whatever reason, that shape is perfect. So let's just copy it. Take the mold or whatever. Let's talk about the insides and the contents that they use. Rice. I'm sure there's little pellets. I'm sure there's like sand in some and grains, whatever.
I don't know. I've tried to find out. The Mino one I believe they use a similar thing to the LP, but I could be wrong. Perhaps one of your listeners might actually know. But they're these very tiny black looking pellets that are almost like a ball bearing / and there's a seed that is a lot like this called a totumo seed. And the totumo seed is actually what you hear in the Colombian style maracas, and amazing sounding seeds. But these look kind of like them. They're black, and those are a lot larger. These that are in the Mino and the LP shakers are very, very tiny, right? And I actually, I don't know. I tried to find out what they're called. I don't know exactly what they're called or where they're getting them from. But one of my older Mino ones fell apart. So since it cracked, instead of just duct taping him, I just decided to put him in this Fred Flintstone vitamin bottle because it's plastic, right?
Oh yeah.
And then it turned out. Listen to this sound. I mean, come on, man. That's almost that's very similar too. So here's an actual Mino one, right? And here, it's just
but I can hear. It's interesting because I can hear more with the Flintstones one. I can hear more of the chamber, if you will. Like I can hear more of the room. It's got more room to work its way around there. Like I guess it'd be like a deeper sound almost, which is interesting to think about.
So there's the thing is like how much you fill up inside, right? And you would think that the more you put in there, sometimes the louder it's going to get. One of the things that I've found is when you're making your shaker, sometimes the less you want to get more volume. Because if you start putting, and it depends on what the container is made out of and what you're putting in there, but when it's less, now they are not filling up the space. So they're literally hitting the container, the element's hitting that. So now it might have a brighter sound that cuts through. So you have to kind of play with that sound, right? And that is really a big deal when you talk about wood or glass, right? So like for instance, here we have a glass bottle that you can get at a hobby store, right? And then you have BBs in there, but it's a very, very bright, shimmery sound, right? Yeah. So then it all depends. But then if you're present in the moment and using your hand and paying attention, you can take out whatever kind of shimmer. So now I have a shimmery shaker, but I can have a darker, slushy one by using my hand.
To mute it, basically.
To mute it, exactly. Yeah. And then which a lot of your listeners probably do as well, is now you can play accents with that as well, because now you're playing with the multiple sounds, right?
Yeah. That seems more of like a bald man thing, like a junk hat, almost where you're kind of like you're using the metal and the glass to get kind of that style.
Yep.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Now, when you're using and doing this stuff, is this, I mean, obviously live is one thing, but adding things over, I mean, it seems like a lot of overdubbing where you would do like an accent on a snare and layering all this. But I guess it leads to the question of, is there too much shaker? You have to know when to stop with the shaking. Am I right? I mean, because it can get too slushy.
Yes. And then it comes down to, especially when you mentioned that term in dynamics, sometimes playing more staccato or more legato i.e. slushy. Sometimes if it's too much, it's just that maybe you need to play more staccato, and maybe playing too legato and slushy is filling up the space. But the thing about the shaker, as I'm sure many will agree, is it's the type of instruments, if you're playing it in the fashion of, instead of just a hit, you're playing it as an ostinato or to fill the space. Once you play it, it's almost like you're committed. Because when you take the shaker out, you notice when it's gone.
That's true.
You know? So it is definitely something that, okay, when you introduce it, it's almost like you want to introduce it in a place where, okay, when you take it out, you either just go right out or you have some other instrument to help you with that transition. But you can start getting happy with that. And then it's difficult sometimes to find out when you want it to come in or when you don't, because the other thing that I've noticed is that a shaker, if you play it with a lot of nuance and a lot of dynamics, it's a very, I'm trying to find a different word than trance. But if you think about trance, it just becomes very groovy.
Hypnotic kind of,
Yes, very hypnotic. And sometimes you don't want that to be hypnotic. You want it to be, because then you just kind of get lost in the groove. But maybe we want a little more intensity in that and a little less of the groove and the hypnotic groove, right?
Yeah.
So that's the other thing about that.
How do you classify all the different shakers?
Yeah, that's a great question. I actually initially was not going to put this in the shaker course because I was going to have it as a separate instrument, which I may still kind of make that a whole separate course.
Yeah, I could see that.
So this is, I consider it like, I don't know if I would say a rattler, but I just kind of considered it its own thing. Because if you think about, like behind me, I have the shekere here, shekere. And this guy here, for the listeners, it's a gourd with plastic beads, right?
Oh, yeah.
And so
those are awesome.
Yeah, and this is very much related to the kabasa that we were talking about earlier, holding in your hand and twisting. So that's where the invention of this instrument comes into play, because and this is a Cuban style shekere, right? Which has this kind of like mouth, and you play it by like a shaker, right? You play it back and forth. It's real loud, but you play it back and forth here, okay? That's the Cuban version, but the West African version, you have it where it's has the beads falling or twisting, and you kind of twist it and shake it. But anyways, instruments like these, before they became fiberglass, right? They might break, but this can kind of take a similar thing, right? To that, but you don't have to worry about breaking this. You can get that sound. So I really, to be honest, kind of in my mind classified these more as like rattlers, right?
Yeah, but rattlers that you can shake and get a really good sound out of. So they do definitely kind of, in the Venn diagram, they go kind of over into the other side a bit.
Yeah. I mean, and they're definitely, and the other thing is, in my mind, as a person who loves to play folk instruments and learn those styles and traditions and playing Afro-Cuban music and various other styles of music, I think of them, sometimes I think of like this shaker as a shaker, because it's not necessarily, to me, a traditional instrument. Although this is inspired by the gansa from samba music from Brazil, but it's been westernized, right? And then playing in pop music. Yeah. Whereas this is very much still directly connected to rumba, from Cuba, to various forms of Latin American music, right? So in my mind, the kabasa is just the kabasa, and the shakers are the shakers. But at the end of the day, yes, I'm playing the shaker. So so then I thought about it. I was like, well, those are all still shakers. And then the maracas outside of just like picking them up and playing are very intimidating to a lot of people. So I'm like, okay, but that's a form of shakers. So it would be good to have that in the course, because you're still shaking it, right?
Yeah.
So then I can have that in the class and teach some Afro-Cuban rhythms and some styles of playing, because really the maracas are shakers. What really differentiates them is that you're playing with both hands. Whereas in a lot of pop contexts, we tend to play a shaker with one hand.
While doing something else. Yeah, I've never thought about that, because maracas, you're almost drumming in the air a little bit.
Absolutely. And there are particular rhythms and styles that you would play on the maracas, right? That would themselves to different genres, bolero, guaracha, all of these son different styles of playing. And what I realized is the reason that when I'm playing and I do stuff like this, right? And so what I'm doing for your listeners is I'm playing alternating left and right with the shaker. Yeah. But then I'm going back to one, two, one hand, two hands. And so the reason that I do a lot of stuff like this with both hands, that's from my maraca playing. And it's very natural for me to do that. So if I'm playing and I'm on, playing some like rock pop music or playing at my church or what have you, then if I'm doing this, it's very natural for me to take the other hand and now to add a different shaker and add accents and play with the microphone.
Yeah, I was gonna say with the mic, you can almost even in the room do some cool kind of stereo thing where you've got one over here and one over here. And I know, with percussion you can do some amazing stuff just with the mix with panning and really play with people's ears. And it's cool to see you do that, because even just on a single mic, you can kind of hear it with both your hands doing different things. So there's a lot of technique there.
So I realized that, because for me in my mind, I'm like, okay, that's natural. This is natural for me to do. But then I realized, oh wait, this is being informed by my maraca playing. So that technique, I was like, well, then that maracas are definitely shakers. They should be added there, because if you learn just a little bit about it, whether or not you want to play maracas is one thing, whether or not you want that technique and be able to have a certain amount of command, a certain amount of independence with the technique is a whole nother thing, right?
Yeah.
So, and with these shakers, a lot of the different folk traditions, for instance, back to the shekere, right? With this beaded gourd instrument, there's things that I'm do right with my hands that is almost like akin to a palm finger technique on congas or whatnot. But all of that technique lends itself to fine motor movement. So when you're playing a shaker, you're now adding all of that stuff into it, because you're playing a shaker, but you're also playing these rhythms, right?
Sure. Let's say for people, you are a seasoned veteran who you've done this for a long time. You've got, your timing is down, your rhythm is down, everything is amazing. But what if you're just starting out and you're just, in a garage band and you're recording a demo on a laptop and you're kind of hearing us talking and you're going, oh man, maybe it would be really cool to add on a little bit of, my baby brother has an egg shaker, a Nuno or whatever. Let me add that on. Any advice for them? Because I have found that it's pretty easy to speed up while you're playing, and you kind of, you get off a little bit while you're doing it, and you got to focus on doing the same thing for a long time to get through the track. But any advice for first time shakers out there?
Yes. So I get this scenario or this question from time to time, and right off the top of my head, there's two things that come to mind. And the first is that maybe that particular person just hasn't really spent enough time with the instrument. And that's the thing, is you have to think about it as an instrument, because you are literally playing a pattern, and you're playing a pattern that you are now hyper focusing on and listening to. If you were playing live or just playing with someone and it didn't matter as much, and they're playing and strumming along on the guitar, well, their strumming pattern or the piano chunking away is covering some of those areas where you drop in and out. But now if you're listening to it on the headphones, you can hear all of it. So the fact that you might not have spent enough time in that situation, that context, means that you didn't know that you had those holes in your playing. So
sure, good call, yeah.
So it's like anything else, where it's something that you first have to decide in your mind and admit that this is something that you need to spend time with in order to get good at. Now, we know as drummers, that especially if you want it to sound a certain way, right? At the end of the day, it's a shaker, man. I mean, if you could clean it up and edit it, it's fine. But if you, on the slower song, sometimes when we play slower songs, like you're talking about speeding up, let's say it's a slower song, because this is often where that question really gets into the woods with, the shaker, is sometimes there's less instrumentation on those slower songs. So something that has a regular pattern as opposed to just playing a chord, change, chord, different progression. Now we're playing the same thing. So the mistakes are going to stick out more because you have a steady pattern. So when you break the pattern, you notice it. So then spending time with it, if you say, okay, well then this is something that I really want to get good at, then I have to actually practice it. And so if you just have that understanding and commit to taking it seriously, instead of, oh, well, it's just a shaker, you'll spend more time with it. I personally...
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah. And stop me at any time as I go on. No. I spent a lot of time playing with the shakers. A lot of my time spending with them was playing really long, lots of gospel church services, right? We're talking about maybe a situation where, it's been many years, but where maybe I'm playing on like a Thursday night, then maybe there's a conference, then there was a Sunday. This is when I was like in my early 20s. And then, so you got these convocations, conferences, Sunday, and the praise and worship, man, the service might start at 10 o'clock and then the preacher doesn't get up till 1 o'clock in the afternoon. So you're not playing. Wow. Or 12 o'clock. Sounds like an exaggeration, but some of your listeners will go, no, I've been in those places. All right. So, so you're literally playing for sometimes an hour and a half plus of music every Sunday. Now, if you add that with practices, if you add that with rehearsals, if you add that up with other services, there were literally weeks where I was playing, months where I was playing 3 or 4 times a week for hours at a time. So if I'm literally playing bongos with my right hand, and I just got to playing a shaker and all these songs, I didn't sit here initially and literally practice the shaker, but I got so acquainted with those patterns that I was playing, 16th note, 18th note patterns, that I was able to manipulate the rhythm however I wanted because I just spent so much time doing it. So I say that because sometimes you'll meet guys that play these types of instruments like the kabasa, the gansa from Brazil, these folk instruments, and say, oh, I didn't practice. I say, yeah, but then when you look at their history, like, bro, you were 8 years old playing it for hours and hours and hours and hours. So that means that there's really no way of getting around having to spend some time in practicing playing that. So the shortcut could be learning how to cut and paste and loop.
You read my mind. I was going to say, no matter what you say at the end, I was going to say, now, but if this is your first time and you just want it on your track, play it for 4 measures and copy and paste it, because that's what everyone does.
That's what everyone does. Boom. And at the same time, this is why, now AI, before it was like, this was the situation we were talking about with recording technology and everyone having a studio, and then you can program these beats. It kind of phases us out of the situation as session musicians. And then AI, you can say, play 16th note, blah, 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 whatever, to be able to play it. But now the creativity of a guy coming in and saying, oh, well, I can play this shaker for 3 minutes if you want me to. And I can add accents mimicking the vocalist. Now it's my creativity, right? And doing something unexpected. I become like the AI. So, anyways, that's a rabbit trail.
No. And I think you're 100% right, though. And the flip side of playing 4 measures and looping it is that even that is robotic because you don't get the little velocity change here and there. Like it's like programming something with MIDI. It would be like, you do a drum beat, you program a 2/4 beat for a whole song with, 16th notes or 8th notes on a hi-hat.
Yeah.
It sounds like a robot. Whereas if you play it with a real person, every little, every kick pattern every kick hit is a little bit different.
Right.
And that's organic. Same thing with the shaker is like, you want that little subtle difference. Like you want it to be on time and damn near perfect, but it being a little bit not perfect at points adds a human element, which you can't, you can't get from a machine.
And before we maybe not get to, I want to mention that gets, when you talk about almost not being perfect, what the shaker is very, when we talk about like these little nuanced, almost not locked into a grid, is similar to what we talk about, like New Orleans style jazz playing between the cracks, we say. But a lot of that comes from the samba. So a lot of this shaker playing is informed by a lot of that Brazilian feel, right? So you're playing that. It's not quite a steady. Just if I could play just a steady 16th note, 1 E and a 2 E and a 3 E and a 4, but it's not. It's and then you can add more and more or less of that swing, but that is related to that samba feel, right? Or now you have that same thing with the Afro-Cuban.
For sure.
Right? But we could even get into how even that's all connected, because you have people like Tito Puente and others traveling into Brazil going, oh, I like this. Let's put this in the Afro-Cuban music. So, there's no immaculate conception in the music.
No, it's a mix. And it made me think too of like going back, to the beginning of man. I'm sure people have been shaking things.
Yes.
In Africa, in even back in like the old, like, in Asian countries, in China, with like all the amazing percussion stuff over there. There has to be shaker type devices just in every culture all over the world to just supplement music and add that rhythm. Yeah,
you'll see it. Even in the 21 or 22 Spanish speaking countries, there's different ones. You got the eco in Brazil. You have, the which is like the guido. So we're scraping, but we're playing that kind of notion. And then you have the maracas in that we had talked about. You have this guy here in East Africa, which is the kayam, right? And then which is played in many different ways. It's basically, for your listeners, it's a flat, how would you say, like a rectangle with like bamboo, hard grass, with seeds inside, and there's handles on each side. And then you could play it like this and then use your thumb.
It kind of looks like an African version of like a washboard or something with a completely different, not really, but sort of.
Exactly. Yeah, it does. And so you have things like this, the kayam or the kayamba or the maravan, depending on where you're at, in the southern eastern side, in the eastern islands like Mauritius in East Africa. So you have stuff like that all over the world, right? You're right. And which also makes me think about the fact that a lot of like the maracas, so we talked about, those are often, by many anthropologists, historians, many folklorists will say, a lot of that is the contribution of the indigenous people. So you have the Arawaks, the Tainos. So that's where a lot of that is said to come from.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So tell people a little bit more about your course. Should they be an experienced drummer to sign up for this? What level do you think they need to come in at? And who is your target kind of audience with this? And just more about it in general.
It's targeted towards very basic. So, somebody that's a singer that says, hey, I'm usually asked to play shakers. I'm a little intimidated by it. So
that's cool.
Yeah, so it goes from there, and then I have some more advanced stuff in there. So it's really, a lot of it is fundamentals and basics, but there's enough in there that that those that are a little more intermediate would benefit from. It's also something I believe that educators will benefit from, that they could just use as a resource, a band director or someone like that, to point towards their students to. Maybe play a video in their class in high school or what have you, if he doesn't play percussion. But so as of right now, what it is a self-guided class and I don't have it up on there yet, but eventually in the next few days, I was going to upload a video and a PDF of my suggestions on which videos, depending on what you're trying to do. So that in that sense, it'd be more of an actual course. And then eventually all of my courses will be probably either moved to like the school platform, SKOOL, those websites where you're literally doing modules. But this right now is basically, it's not a subscription thing. Is once you purchase the class, it's basically like a online class is what it is. Then you watch the videos based on what it is you're trying to do. So it's broken up into the very overviews, fundamentals, how to hold it, how to play different shakers. into, okay, well, here's a couple exercises you can do. Here's a few rhythms you can do. Here's the different instruments. So now you have the kabasa, part 1, part 2, part 3, shekere, part 1, part 2, part 3. And it starts with an overview and then goes from more advanced. And then there's like a little description. So right now it's
cool.
There's a link tree if you're on Instagram. If you go to Instagram and you go to like William Johnson Music there and you follow that link, and you go to my course, it will take you to where the class is actually hosted. And so if you purchase it, you can either stream it or you can download it. You don't have to, it's not a subscription. So once you buy it, it's yours. And then if I add 3 to 5 videos, like I have about 7 videos that are going to be added this weekend, as long as you go into the class, whatever's uploaded, you can continue to get, right?
Oh, that's nice. Okay. So you're not missing out on future stuff because you bought it a week before you uploaded new stuff.
Right.
Man, it makes me think too. You're just talking about the kids and the and just getting kids into it, as it's kind of a lower barrier of entry, I guess, than getting a kid thrown in on a drum set or a singer and a songwriter where they can just take it and do it themselves. But sometimes you feel silly being like, I want to do this and add this shaker, but I want someone to teach me. And it's like, you can't really go to a drum teacher and be like, no, I don't want that drum set. I want you to teach me the shaker. It'd be like, no, I'm not.
And
that's silly, but
I get that from time to time, especially when you go places like different churches where it's a volunteer based type situation.
Sure.
And you have, or a band, like a wedding band, and they want the person up front to be a little more dynamic and say, the way that we're going to have it be dynamic is put some maracas in your hand. And it's like, oh my goodness, dude. Really, I don't, it's like, so I've actually had people in the past and I've actually given little mini classes, little mini master classes, workshop. Okay, well, you can do this and, okay, well, just do this and that. I mean, there are little like very complex, nuanced things I'm doing with my fingers, but I'm like, you don't have to do all that. But if you move your wrist this way, so there's little things like that I add for that. Now, I will say you reminded me of something that I thought was really cool. Is I had a young man that I helped teach front ensemble for a local high school as an instructor in the marching band. And there's a young man that was playing this past band season. He's an incredible pianist. So he was playing the synthesizer, guitar solo, all that incredible. And he actually mentioned that when he started playing shakers, because he played a little bit of drums, he's teaching himself, but not much. But he said he noticed that when he started playing shakers to kind of like make little recordings or what have you, that it actually made him a better guitarist. Because if you think about now, if you play something like guitar, okay, take that as an example, and you didn't start off as a drummer, something like all those strumming patterns that you're doing is something maybe foreign or something you have to learn. Whereas for us, it's just like, bro, that's like learning your scales.
It's you have the
So now imagine if that guitarist can do that, can keep a solid 16th note shaker pattern or 8th note with his hand. That is directly going to affect the way that he comes on with a pick, right? So I just thought it was interesting that he told me that it made him a better guitarist. And he started noticing, he started being able to get all these intricate, more nuanced playing.
I think it loosens your wrist. I mean, there's something about it that you again, we take for granted. I remember my wife got a ukulele and it was like, she was trying to learn it and she kept asking me about these strumming patterns. And I mean, I've messed around on guitars and ukuleles and stuff I'm not very good, but you've been around it. I've been around it for 20 years, but you take for granted that like when you're starting out, you overthink everything and your wrist is solid and it's just not moving right. But getting that shaker absolutely would loosen that up and gives you more field of motion, if that's the right term, to move. So, William, why don't you tell everyone as we wrap up here, website, socials, YouTube, all your stuff is incredible. I cannot tell people enough to go and check it out. It's great.
Man, I appreciate you, man. Love to you and your family.
Thank you.
And all of your listeners as well. I'm a listener of the podcast. I have a website, williamjohnsonmusic.com. A lot of my links are on there. I know that a lot of us are on social media. So on Instagram, it's William Johnson Music. And then on TikTok, it's William Johnson Music. I think on TikTok it might be William Johnson Muse or something like that. But if you type in William Johnson Music, it should come up. On YouTube, it's William Johnson Music again, and on Facebook, it's William Johnson, and I think it's William Johnson Music as well. So it's William Johnson Music everywhere.
William Johnson Music.
Yeah. I try. Now there's a couple other William Johnsons out there. There's a very common name, but you'll see right away the other William Johnsons that make music. We look a little bit different, right? So.
Okay.
I'm not.
I gotcha.
I'm not an 80-year-old, guy from the other side of the world that's, teaching like the vibraphone or something. So, William Johnson Music, and then the links to, like, if you're interested to learn more about this shaker class or something like that, there's a link tree, which is just the for those of you who may or may not know, there's just it's a link that has a bunch of links in it, and then you can just look where it says shaker course, or you'll see a bunch of my other stuff on their YouTube channel and all of that.
Yep. Love the link tree. Good way to get people in the right place. And yours is very clear and well curated. So I will put a link in the description of this, per usual, for everything that William has recommended, all of the many William Johnson Music platforms that are out there. And you guys can all check it out. So first, thank you to everyone for listening. If you're this far into our deep dive on shakers, then you are a shaker expert at this point.
Oh, man.
thanks for shaking with us, everyone. And again, William, thank you for joining, doing this at night. Everyone who's been on the show recently has been doing this at 8:30, 9 o'clock at night because of the madness of my kids and going to bed and stuff. So I appreciate your time, man. Thank you so much.
Absolutely.